Okay, let's unpack this. There are some ideas that feel so fundamental, so universally good, that you'd think we'd all agree on what they mean. Freedom, or liberty, feels like one of those.
Absolutely.
Who doesn't want to be free? And yet, dig just a little below the surface, and it turns out defining liberty is one of the most debated, contentious, and, well, even revolutionary ideas in human history.
Absolutely. It's a principle universally desired, something lauded across vastly different political theories, from liberal to idealist to Marxist. Nobody fundamentally quarrels with freedom as an ultimate goal.
Right.
But the profound, often violent disagreements come in the means and the mode of actually realizing that freedom in the real world.
And here's where it gets really interesting right from the start.
Sure.
Our source material for this deep dive, based on excerpts from O.P. Gauba's An Introduction to Political Theory, points out something fascinating.
Yeah.
Even champions of absolutism and authoritarianism pay lip service to freedom. They might claim, for example, that for ordinary people, the truest path to freedom lies not in individual autonomy, but through submission to an authority figure or system they see as embodying some form of excellence or higher purpose.
Which, as you said, seems counterintuitive to say the least. How can submission be freedom? But it highlights how slippery the concept can be and how profoundly its meaning can be reinterpreted.
Exactly.
Our deep dive is going to take us through Gauba's exploration of this complex idea, helping you understand the different philosophical angles it's approached from.
Our mission today is to unpack this concept, trace its evolution, understand the different dimensions it operates within, and really dive into the major philosophical battles fought over its meaning, particularly that famous distinction between negative and positive liberty.
A key distinction.
We want to extract the key insights and arguments from this foundational text, help you understand these competing interpretations, and give you a solid handle on how philosophers have tried to balance individual freedom with the needs of society. It's a complex topic, but we'll try to make it clear and engaging, pulling out the core ideas from the source material for you.
Right. So as you listen to this deep dive, keep in mind this initial framing from the source. While freedom is universally acclaimed, the paths proposed to achieve it are incredibly diverse and often contradictory.
Yeah.
Sometimes even suggesting that giving up conventional notions of individual autonomy and submitting to an external authority is the path to true freedom. It sets the stage for just how contested this terrain is.
So let's start with the fundamental nature of liberty itself. Gauba presents this not just as a political concept, but as a distinctive human quality.
Yes, that's a key starting point the source emphasizes. Liberty is described as a quality unique to human beings, distinguishing us fundamentally from other living beings.
How so?
Well, animals, birds, insects are seen as driven primarily by instinct, focused on the raw struggle for existence and survival of the fittest, geared solely towards mere survival.
Just getting by.
Exactly. Man, as Homo sapiens, is seen as having aims beyond simple existence, the capacity for reason, creation, and the ability to control and harness nature for those higher purposes. Freedom is presented as this distinctive quality that enables those higher aims, that allows us to pursue a life beyond mere biological necessity.
And because of this distinctive human quality, this desire for something more than just survival, the yearning for liberty becomes a powerful force for change in society. The source highlights its role in historical struggles.
Exactly. Liberty has historically been a major driver of revolutionary struggles. Think about movements against despotism, against feudal lords, or against foreign rule and colonial powers.
It's the rallying cry.
It's almost always the voice of the oppressed sections of society rising up, challenging not just specific policies, but the fundamental injustice and the established vested interests that deny them their freedom.
And this struggle for liberty, according to the source, is almost always intertwined with the philosophy of equality. You can't really demand freedom without also demanding to be treated as equal to those who are currently free while you are not.
That connection is crucial and often overlooked. When oppressed groups, whether it's peasant revolts challenging the perceived superiority of lords, or national struggles for independence against colonial powers claiming civilizational dominance rise up, they aren't just fighting for personal freedom from external constraint.
No, what else?
They are challenging the fundamental premise of their oppressor's power, which is often built on an alleged superiority of virtue, capacity, or race. They are implicitly, if not explicitly, demanding equality and justice based on the universal principle of human equality. They are saying, we are just as human, just as capable, and just as deserving of freedom as you are.
So the demand for liberty often comes hand in hand with saying, hey, you've defined us as lesser, as tools or beasts of burden, but we are full human beings equal to you.
That's the core idea. And the source provides a really striking historical example of how privileged classes have historically tried to justify the status quo and their dominance by denying this universal human equality as a basis for freedom. Aristotle's defense of slavery.
Ah, yes, this is fascinating because Aristotle was such a foundational thinker. But his views on slavery are, well, jarring from a modern perspective.
Absolutely. He argued that men differed in moral excellence and that slaves weren't full human beings capable of the kind of virtue or rational self-governance that free men possessed. He saw them merely as living tools.
Living tools, that's quite a phrase.
Right. And he even suggested slaves somehow benefited from virtue simply by serving masters who did possess it. Plus, he argued slavery provided the leisure for free men, which he saw as essential for them to exercise virtue, participate in politics, and live the good life.
So the enslavement of some was justified for the higher life of others.
That was his argument. And this, according to Gaba, is a typical historical example of how privileged classes defend their position and deny liberty to others by claiming inherent superiority or virtue for themselves, effectively defining the oppressed group as less than fully human or capable.
It's a justification for denying liberty to others based on a claimed lack of inherent capacity or virtue on the part of the oppressed, standing in stark contrast to those who rise up demanding universal human equality as the undeniable basis for liberty.
So struggles for liberty aren't just about throwing off physical chains or external restraints. They are fundamentally about reestablishing inherent human values and challenging systems that treat people like animals or tools.
Right.
Connecting right back to that initial idea of liberty as a distinctive, defining quality of man. It's a fight for recognition of full humanity.
So if you think about historical movements, whether it's the civil rights movement, anti-colonial struggles, labor movements demanding fair treatment, or even modern disability rights movements, many are rooted in this deep-seated fight for liberation against perceived injustice, inequality, and systems that devalue or limit the potential of human beings based on arbitrary criteria.
Exactly.
It's the voice against injustice, seeking to reestablish universal human values and the right to live a life of dignity and self-direction.
Precisely. It's the assertion of inherent worth.
Okay, so we've established liberty as a core human quality tied to our capacity for more than just survival, and a historical force for change linked inextricably to demands for equality. But this immediately brings up the central problem that political theory has grappled with. How does individual liberty fit into a society of other individuals, all potentially asserting their own claims to freedom?
This is precisely where politics becomes necessary. The problem of liberty involves adjusting the claims between the individual and society or the community. The state enters the picture as the instrument or agency that regulates these relations, ideally in a way that maximizes freedom for everyone.
And the source highlights two crucial tensions that arise from this need for adjustment: the tension between liberty and license, and the tension between liberty and authority.
Let's tackle liberty and license first. The source is very clear. If you take individual liberty to an extreme, defining it as the complete absence of any restraint whatsoever, disregarding the legitimate interests and freedoms of others, it doesn't remain liberty.
No, it becomes something else.
It degenerates into license.
And the examples given are pretty vivid, painting a picture of chaos.
Yes. License is a condition where one person's absolute liberty becomes another's constraint or oppression. It's the liberty of the strong suppressing the weaker.
Like a jangle.
The source uses the analogy of large fish swallowing smaller ones and then a still larger one swallowing the former, a kind of brutal, natural hierarchy, but in a civil society context.
A free-for-all, basically, where might makes right. A thief's freedom to steal becomes a direct and constant threat to everyone else's security and property.
Or a driver's absolute freedom to drive however they please without rules or regard for others immediately endangers everyone else on the road. The source argues such a situation is self-contradictory and cannot be permitted in a civil society.
Why self-contradictory?
Because it defeats the very purpose of having a society at all, and it undermines the possibility of universal freedom. If freedom means no limits on anyone's actions, then anyone strong enough can simply take away the freedom of others.
Right.
This doesn't lead to more freedom in total. It leads to the freedom of a single individual or a dominant group at the expense of everyone else's subjection. Such a state of license destroys freedom for the vast majority.
So regulated liberty isn't less liberty in total. It's the only way for liberty to exist meaningfully for everyone. Restraint isn't the opposite of freedom in this view. It's the necessary condition for universal freedom.
Exactly. The source makes this point powerfully, quoting L.T. Hobhouse, a key liberal thinker, who put it this way: "The unchartered freedom of one would be the conditional servitude of all but one. And conversely, a freedom to be enjoyed by all must impose some restraint upon all." It beautifully captures the idea that mutual freedom requires mutual restraint.
That's a great quote. It fundamentally reframes restraint, not as a taking away of freedom, but potentially as a way of creating it for others and for the collective.
And Ernest Barker, quoted in the source, applies this specifically to the socioeconomic context, which we touched on earlier.
Yeah.
He talks about the liberty of the capital owner needing to be adjusted to the liberty of the worker.
How so?
The owner's freedom to determine work conditions, set wages, and hours must be balanced by the worker's liberty to work under conditions that leave him a free agent, with dignity, and perhaps give him a share in determining those conditions.
So without regulation.
The owner's freedom effectively curtails the worker's.
So regulation isn't diminishing liberty in some abstract sense, but adjusting it between competing unequal claims so that it's actually possible and operative for more people, especially the less powerful.
The source makes this point explicitly and powerfully, quoting Barker again. "A relative and regulated liberty, actually operative and enjoyed, is liberty greater in amount than absolute liberty could ever be, if indeed such liberty could ever exist or ever amount to anything more than nothing at all."
Wow.
This is a key nugget of insight. The only freedom that matters is real, operative freedom, and that requires regulation.
That fundamentally challenges the idea that any regulation automatically means less freedom. It suggests thoughtful regulation can increase the total amount of freedom available in society.
Which brings us neatly to the second tension, liberty and authority. If individual liberty can't be absolute because individuals aren't perfect and unregulated individual freedom leads to license, can the state's authority, the authority meant to regulate things, be absolute?
The source says no, because states and those who wield state power aren't perfect either. This tension between individual liberty and state authority has been a thorny issue, a perennial conflict in political theory for centuries.
Indeed. You have thinkers on different ends of this spectrum, as illustrated by D.D. Raphael, who is quoted in the source. Hobbes, for example, famously argued for a strong, almost absolute sovereign authority, willing to severely limit individual liberty for the benefits of state order and security.
Why?
Seeing it as the only escape from the brutal state of nature, which is essentially the state of license we just discussed, a war of all against all.
The idea being better a strong master than universal chaos.
Right. On the other hand, thinkers like Locke and J.S. Mill advocated for marked limits on state authority to leave as much room as possible for individual liberty, seeing an overreaching state as the primary threat to freedom.
So where exactly should that frontier between individual freedom and state power be drawn? The source points out that limitations on state authority are just as necessary as limitations on individual license to make the state's purpose, which is ultimately to facilitate a free society, meaningful.
Yes, and Raphael is quoted making a subtle but important distinction that helps clarify this: the difference between unlimited legal power and unlimited practical power.
Okay, explain that.
The British Parliament, for example, might be legally omnipotent in the sense that it can pass any law it chooses, but no state, even one with unlimited legal power, can afford to exercise truly unlimited practical power.
Why not? What are the practical limits?
Because any legislature with any sense, particularly one that wants to stay in office, has to consider political possibilities. It has to consider what it can effectively do without causing widespread resistance or losing the support of the population.
Right.
Passing laws that people refuse to obey or that provoke rebellion is legally possible but practically impossible if the state wants to maintain its authority and legitimacy.
Legitimacy again. The source defines legitimacy as the acceptance of an act, an arrangement, or the state itself as lawful by those affected by it. They see it as reasonable, justified, and beneficial.
Right. Legitimacy comes from the people believing the state is necessary, and its actions are lawful, rational, and valuable for the community. A state with widespread, unquestioned legitimacy rarely needs to resort to force to get its citizens to comply.
It doesn't need to push.
Exactly. But if its legitimacy is widely questioned, if people stop believing in its moral right to rule or the fairness of its actions, it's in serious trouble.
Like if the source's examples resonate. If people see the military as illegitimate occupiers, the police as brutal enforcers of arbitrary rules, and the courts as unfair or corrupt.
The source states that clearly. In such a situation, a state might still have power, the ability to get orders obeyed through coercion, through sheer physical force, but it lacks authority.
Which is different.
Which is based in legitimacy, in moral support. Effective state authority relies not on compulsion, but on people accepting it on moral grounds, obeying because they believe it's the right thing to do or beneficial for society, not just because they fear punishment. This makes authority a moral weapon, far more powerful and sustainable than mere physical force.
Okay, so liberty isn't just about the absence of any restraint, but the absence of unreasonable restraints, carefully regulated for the benefit of all within a legitimate authority structure that is itself limited by practical realities and the need for public acceptance.
That sums it up well.
That covers the fundamental nature and scope of liberty. Now let's get more specific and look at the different dimensions or spheres in which this principle of liberty operates.
Right. The source distinguishes between civil, political, and economic liberty as different spheres in which the principle of regulated liberty, the absence of unreasonable restraints, applies.
Let's start with civil liberty. Barker is quoted defining this as the liberty of man in his individual capacity, his personal liberty. And he breaks this down into three key aspects, or articles.
The first is physical freedom, the freedom of life, health, and movement. This is presented as relatively non-controversial compared to other aspects.
Seems basic.
Restrictions here are generally accepted only when they are necessary for public safety, maintaining law and order, which are themselves seen as conditions for freedom, or as punishment for crime according to established fair law. Basic physical security is a prerequisite for any other kind of freedom.
Makes perfect sense. It's hard to exercise freedom of thought or contract if you're constantly in fear for your physical safety or movement is arbitrarily restricted.
The second is intellectual freedom, freedom of thought, belief, expression, and discussion. This is where J.S. Mill features prominently in the source as perhaps the most ardent champion of this specific type of freedom.
Mill, in his famous work on liberty, argued incredibly strongly for this, both from the individual's point of view and from society's perspective.
His core argument, as quoted from On Liberty, is that intellectual freedom and free discussion are absolutely essential for the advancement of knowledge, for discovering truth, and for societal progress. He argued for the fundamental importance of being able to criticize existing institutions and express opinions, even unpopular ones, no matter how offensive they might be to the prevailing attitudes or established power structures.
That was a radical position then and still feels relevant today. His famous argument, quoted in the source, is that silencing an opinion, even one we strongly disagree with, is robbing the human race.
Robbing the human race.
No.
Powerful.
Why? Because, he says, if the opinion is right, we lose the opportunity to correct our own errors and exchange falsehood for truth. But just as importantly, if the opinion is wrong, we lose something else.
What's that?
We lose the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by the collision with error.
That second part is crucial. Mill argued that truth isn't a dead dogma. It needs to be constantly challenged and defended. Debating even wrong opinions sharpens our understanding of why the truth is true, making our grasp of it more vibrant and less likely to be held as mere prejudice.
So it's a workout for the truth.
In a way, yes. It's a powerful utilitarian defense of free speech, arguing it benefits everyone, not just the speaker.
So even wrong opinions are valuable because debating them forces us to articulate and strengthen our understanding of the truth. That's a profound insight.
Absolutely. It underscores the dynamic nature of knowledge and belief. The third article Barker mentions under civil liberty is practical freedom. The freedom of the play of will, of choice, and of contract in our daily interactions with others.
This seems straightforward on the surface. The freedom to enter into agreements, make choices about how you live, as long as you aren't harming others. But the source highlights a crucial difficulty here that connects back to our earlier point about liberty and license.
Yes, the potential for the exploitation of this freedom by a stronger party. L.T. Hobhouse is quoted again, insisting that for freedom of contract to be truly real, there must be substantial equality between the parties.
Equality again?
Without that equality, one party isn't really making a free choice. They're acting under a degree of compulsion because of their weaker position.
This is key. It's not enough to simply say, you're free to sign this contract for starvation wages or dangerous conditions. If one person desperately needs a job to survive and the other holds all the power, owning the factory or the land, is the choice truly free?
Or is it effectively coerced by the necessity of survival? The source drives this home with an extreme, almost chilling example. Absolute freedom of contract in an extreme, unregulated scenario could theoretically allow or even force a man to sell himself into slavery, permanently losing his freedom.
That's horrifying.
It notes that modern law, recognizing this danger, wisely imposes reasonable limitations on freedom of contract to prevent such exploitation and preserve a baseline of human dignity and liberty.
So, civil liberty, even in its practical dimension of making choices and agreements, needs careful regulation to prevent it from becoming a tool of oppression for the stronger party against the weaker one. It requires certain underlying conditions, like a degree of equality between parties, to be meaningful.
Precisely. It reinforces the idea that freedom isn't just absence of external restraint, but also requires certain underlying social and economic conditions to be operative and prevent it from being used to destroy the freedom of others.
Moving on to political liberty.
Yeah.
This is the liberty enjoyed specifically as a citizen, participating in the life of the community and the state.
Barker is quoted again, contrasting an older, more limited view, like Blackstone's in the 18th century, seeing political liberty primarily as the right of the individual to do whatever the law does not forbid, essentially curbing government power, with the modern democratic view.
What's the modern view?
In a democracy where the government is ideally constituted by the people and serves their interests, political liberty is about the positive ability of citizens to participate in constituting and controlling their government.
How do you constitute and control the government in this view?
Through mechanisms like universal suffrage, the right to vote and participate in a general act of choice or election, and through a general and continuous process of discussion.
Meaning?
Which means freedom of speech, assembly, press, and the right to organize politically.
This view postulates the positive right of people to be represented and to influence public policy decisions by freely expressing their views, organizing, and holding their leaders accountable. The aim is to make the state sensitive and responsible to the prevailing social consciousness and the will of the people.
So the formal rights of democratic participation, the freedom to vote, to run for office, to debate public issues, to protest, to form parties.
Yes, the bedrock of formal democracy. However, the source, like with civil liberty, adds a critical caveat. Mere formal political liberty can be deeply inadequate in securing real freedom.
Exactly. Where elections are heavily influenced by money, by manipulative power, by control of information, and where the mass media, the channels of public discussion, are controlled by narrow privileged classes or big business interests.
Then what?
The source argues that mere political liberty can hardly secure real or substantive freedom for the people.
That's a significant point. Having the right to vote or speak doesn't guarantee your voice is actually heard, or that the system is truly responsive if underlying power structures, particularly economic ones, can distort the process, control the information flow, or manipulate outcomes.
It suggests that political liberty, too, requires certain underlying conditions, perhaps more equitable access to resources, a free and diverse media landscape, limitations on the influence of money in politics to be truly meaningful and effective for everyone, not just those with power and resources.
Which leads us, perhaps inevitably, directly into economic liberty. This is liberty considered in the capacity of a worker, whether with hand or brain, engaged in gainful occupation.
And this is presented as the sphere where liberty is most capable of conflicting interpretations and direct confrontation between different parties. Employer versus worker, trader versus consumer, landlord versus tenant.
These aren't just abstract philosophical differences.
No, they play out in concrete, daily power dynamics. For one party, it's the freedom to seek maximum profit, maximum return on investment, minimal costs. For the other, it's the insistence on reasonable terms of employment, fair wages, safe working conditions, reasonable prices for goods, quality products, fair rent.
A direct clash of interests, often.
The source argues, much like with civil liberty, that if the stronger party in these economic relationships isn't curbed, liberty in this sphere becomes a mockery for the weaker party. This is where the adjustment between the claims of liberty and equality becomes most essential, not an optional extra.
This is where the powerful quote from R.H. Tawney comes in, making a very strong case for the link between economic equality and freedom.
Yes, he says that if liberty is viewed realistically, meaning it implies not just civil and political rights on paper, but also securities that the economically weak will not be at the mercy of the economically strong.
Then what follows?
Then a large measure of equality isn't the enemy of liberty, something you sacrifice for it, but essential to it.
That's a powerful statement. Economic equality isn't inimical to liberty in the economic sphere. It's a necessary foundation for liberty to be real for the economically weak.
Without some leveling of the economic playing field or protections for the less powerful, the freedom of the strong simply translates into the oppression of the weak.
And this is precisely where the source says the concepts of negative and positive liberty come into direct conflict and confrontation. Do you define freedom here as merely the absence of state restraint on economic actors? Negative liberty for owners and employers?
Or do you define it as the state positively intervening to remove impediments like poverty, lack of opportunity, or exploitative conditions for workers and consumers? Positive liberty. That's the core tension.
And without that positive action,
Without social policy geared towards safeguarding vulnerable sections in the economic sphere, things like minimum wage laws, workplace safety regulations, consumer protection, social security nets, the principle of liberty in this realm is seen as devoid of any content or substance for a significant portion of the population. It might exist for the powerful, but not for the vulnerable.
so economic liberty highlights, perhaps most clearly, the tension between different ideas, what freedom requires, just being left alone by the state, negative, or needing active intervention by the state or collective to ensure basic conditions and a level playing field, positive.
Which is the perfect segue into that famous historical and philosophical debate between negative and positive liberty, as discussed in the source.
Okay, let's dive into that key distinction that has shaped so much political thought. The source says that liberal writers often use liberty and freedom interchangeably and see it as the supreme value. Negative liberty is defined most simply as absence of restraint.
Or absence of constraint or coercion, particularly from other human beings or the state.
Right. In the negative view, the state's primary role concerning liberty is negative. It shouldn't restrict the individual unless absolutely necessary to prevent harm to others. Freedom is the space where you are left alone.
And positive liberty, how does that differ?
That concept calls for a more active, positive state role, not just to refrain from restricting, but to remove impediments that prevent individuals from actually exercising their freedom or realizing their potential.
What kind of impediments?
These might not be direct coercion, but things like poverty, lack of education, ill health, or systemic disadvantages.
The source uses the example of the Atlantic Charter's famous four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from fear, freedom from want, to help illustrate this distinction. It does. Freedom of speech and worship are seen as largely negative freedom to act in a certain way, defined by the absence of prevention or prohibition.
You're free to speak.
Yes. But freedom from fear and freedom from want are seen as positive freedom from a restraint or condition. Fear of secret police, war, want due to unemployment, poverty, sickness, which implicitly requires state action, collective effort, and resources to remove or mitigate that restraint.
So freedom from poverty requires positive action, not just absence of restraint.
That's the implication. And the source is careful to state up front that, in some views, these aren't necessarily opposed or contradictory concepts.
Right.
Exactly. They're often presented as complementary, two sides of the same coin, or incomplete without each other, although historically certain thinkers and political movements have strongly prioritized one over the other.
The source traces the rise of negative liberty as the dominant liberal idea to 17th century Europe and the accompanying Industrial Revolution.
This was closely tied to establishing capitalism and challenging the feudal order, which was characterized by various social and economic restraints. The emphasis shifted to freedom from arbitrary government restraint, individual choice, especially in the economic sphere.
And the core axiom.
The core axiom of laissez-faire economics. Everyone knows his own interests best. Therefore, individuals should be left free to pursue their interests with minimal state interference.
And freedom of contract was seen as absolutely essential to this, as we touched on. Thinkers like Henry Sidgwick are mentioned.
Yes, arguing that contracts freely negotiated were inherently just because each individual was presumed to be the best judge of their own interest, so any agreement they voluntarily entered into must be in their best interest.
So the state shouldn't interfere in those bargains.
The state's role in this classical liberal view was minimal, often described as the minimal state or even a necessary evil, whose function was limited to protecting person and property and enforcing contracts, but not imposing its own idea of the good life or interfering in individuals' free transactions.
Who are the key proponents?
Thinkers like Adam Smith, Jeremy Bentham, James Mill, Sidgwick, and Herbert Spencer are cited as favoring this minimal state approach to liberty.
This classical liberal individualist view saw society as an aggregate of independent, atomized, alienated individuals, connected primarily by a mechanical unity of market exchange and contract.
With liberty being defined largely as freedom of trade, enterprise, contract, and market competition, free from external constraint. And historically, it played an important, indeed revolutionary role. It helped clear the way for the development of capitalism and unleashed productive forces that had been constrained by the old feudal system.
But the source notes that by the mid-19th century, the real-world consequences of this pure, unregulated negative liberty became starkly evident in industrializing societies. The bloom came off the rose, so to speak.
Yes, the dark side emerged. Appalling working conditions, child labor, unsafe factories, miserable living conditions for urban workers, vast inequality, and systemic oppression and exploitation became widespread.
So much for everyone knowing their own interests best, leading to good outcomes.
Well, the employer's freedom to hire and fire at will, to dictate terms, made a mockery of the idea of freedom of contract for workers who had no bargaining power and faced insecurity, poverty, and terrible conditions simply to survive.
So the benefits of this negative liberty, defined purely as absence of restraint, were largely confined to the privileged few who owned capital, while it effectively created new forms of unfreedom and constraint for the many who only had their labor to sell.
And this led a new wave of humanist writers, socialists, Marxists, and crucially, what the source calls positive liberals, to demand a redefinition of liberty.
They pushed back.
They argued forcefully that simple state non-intervention, especially economically, wasn't compatible with liberty understood as a universal principle, something that should be possible for everyone.
This is where J.S. Mill, whom we met earlier regarding intellectual freedom, makes another crucial appearance, marking a significant shift within liberal thought towards positive liberalism.
Yes, he's highlighted as the first prominent liberal thinker to really recognize that the working classes were being systematically deprived of their due share and that the state might need to play a more active role. He started as a strict laissez-faire individualist, but significantly modified his views based on the weaknesses of capitalism and the undeniable plight of the working classes he observed.
How did he justify state intervention within a liberal framework?
His key contribution here was the distinction between self-regarding actions, those that affect only the individual performing them, and other regarding actions, those that affect other people.
Okay.
He argued for complete freedom in self-regarding actions, saying society had no business interfering unless the individual was acting out of ignorance and clearly on a self-destructive path. But in other regarding actions, actions that impact others, he conceded the community's right to coerce or regulate if the conduct was prejudicial to its welfare or caused harm to others.
Even if the line between the two is often blurry and debated.
True, it can be.
The significance, according to the source, was Mill's explicit attempt to define a legitimate sphere where individual behavior could and should be regulated by the state or community for the broader interests and welfare.
This marked a crucial theoretical move within liberalism, signaling a shift towards contemplating a positive state role for social welfare, even if it meant curbing individual liberties somewhat in certain economic or social spheres.
Were there specific policies he supported?
Mill's ideas on things like progressive taxation, limiting inheritance, and state provision of education are mentioned as examples of specific policies stemming from this more interventionist positive view.
And later positive liberals like T.H. Green in Britain, followed by L.T. Hobhouse and H.J. Lasky, developed this concept further in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Green, with his influential theory of rights, emphasized the state's positive role not just in preventing hindrances, but in actively creating the social and economic conditions necessary for individuals to realize their moral freedom, to develop their capacities, and live a good life.
Going beyond just preventing harm.
Yes. And Hobhouse and Lasky argued even more strongly that private property wasn't an absolute right, and that the state had a duty to secure people's welfare and provide essential services, even if it curtailed the economic liberty or property rights of a few wealthy individuals or corporations.
This shift towards a positive state role in securing welfare and creating conditions for freedom is something that is very familiar to us today, underpinning the concept and expansion of the welfare state in many modern democracies.
Absolutely. It's a direct lineage from this development in liberal thought that recognized the limitations of pure negative liberty. It's the intellectual foundation for much of modern social policy in liberal states.
But the debate doesn't end there, of course. The source notes that in contemporary political theory, some thinkers have pushed back against this expansion of the state's role and laid renewed emphasis on negative liberty. These thinkers are often called libertarians.
This brings us to influential figures like Isaiah Berlin, F.A. Hayek, Milton Friedman, and Robert Nozick, who offer powerful critiques of the positive liberty concept and the expanded state.
Let's start with Isaiah Berlin, whose 1958 lecture, Two Concepts of Liberty, was hugely influential. The source revisits his definitions. Negative liberty is freedom from interference by other human beings.
Right, and positive liberty is freedom too, which Berlin linked to concepts of self-mastery, or control by a rational higher self over irrational impulses of a lower self.
Berlin's key argument, as presented here, is that political liberty is only negative. The state's legitimate role concerning liberty is limited to ensuring individuals aren't prevented from choosing their course of action by the deliberate interference of other humans.
Positive liberty, as self-mastery, is seen by Berlin as belonging to the individual's internal will and capacity, largely beyond the state's scope, and potentially dangerous if the state tries to enforce a particular notion of the higher self.
He used examples like not being able to fly like an eagle or swim like a whale or being too poor to afford a loaf of bread or access to law courts, arguing these aren't deprivations of political liberty. Why?
Because they relate to individual capacity, natural limitations, or lack of means, not deliberate coercion by other human beings. You're not being prevented from doing these things by another person. That was his key point.
And this is precisely where the source introduces a significant critique of Berlin's framework, arguing he confuses different spheres of life and different types of impediments to freedom.
Yes. The distinction between the moral sphere and what critics see as the material or social sphere of positive liberty.
Explain that.
In the moral sphere, as political theorist Norman Berry clarifies, Berlin's idea of positive liberty as self-mastery, overcoming internal impulses like addiction or laziness, is seen as insightful. The state indeed has limited power to make you master your own desires. That's an internal struggle.
So that part is generally accepted.
Often seen as valuable, yes, but the critique presented in the source focuses heavily on Berlin's analysis of the material sphere, his examples like being too poor to afford bread or legal access. Critics argue these are fundamentally different from natural limitations like not being able to fly.
How are they different?
Exactly. Not being able to fly is a natural, unalterable disability inherent to human biology. But poverty, lack of means, lack of access to essential services like healthcare or justice are often not natural occurrences. They are products of social and economic arrangements.
Like laws and systems.
Precisely. Of laws about property, systems of production, distribution of wealth, access to education arrangements that are alterable by political action.
And the source argues that lack of means resulting from the structure of society can be seen as a form of coercion by other individuals or by the social system itself.
Right. In this view, the poor person isn't just naturally incapable, they are constrained by a system structured by others. If this is true, state intervention to alter those social arrangements and provide access would be justified even by Berlin's own definition of political liberty as freedom from interference by other human beings.
But he dismissed it.
Yet he seems to dismiss it as a political issue. Parekh is quoted asking pointedly why Berlin wouldn't consider a lack of means resulting from social arrangements as interference by other men.
It's a fair question.
And McPherson critiques Berlin's definition as too narrow, neglecting impediments that arise not from direct prohibition, but from a lack of access to the means of life and labor necessary to act. He calls Berlin's a mechanical, inertial concept of freedom, one suited only to a theoretical, complete market society, where everyone has comparable means, which isn't realistic.
So while Berlin's concept of moral self-mastery might be insightful, his application of positive liberty to material conditions and his dismissal of social causes of incapacity as being outside the realm of political freedom are significantly questioned by these critics, according to the source.
Yes, his positive liberty concept is seen as quite different from the positive liberalism discussed earlier, which did see social economic conditions as central to real freedom. He isolates personal freedom from its social context in a way that critics find problematic.
Moving on to F.A. Hayek, another major figure associated with this contemporary emphasis on negative liberty, particularly in works like The Constitution of Liberty. Hayek defined freedom very strictly as not being subject to coercion by the arbitrary will of another human being.
He was very careful to distinguish this specific definition from other related concepts like political freedom, the right to participate in government, inner freedom, the ability to control one's own desires, related to Berlin's moral self-mastery, and what he called freedom as power.
Freedom as power.
Meaning the effective ability to act, having the means to achieve your goals. For Hayek, political freedom can exist even where individual freedom is limited. Inner freedom relates to moral weakness, and freedom as power is something entirely different from and potentially antithetical to true liberty, which is just absence of arbitrary coercion.
And I insisted on this strict, narrow definition precisely to prevent the term freedom from being used to justify extensive state intervention.
Exactly. His argument against freedom as power is that confusing liberty with the effective ability to achieve one's goals justifies endless government measures aimed at enabling people, providing them with means, opportunities, security.
And he saw that as a problem.
He believed this could destroy true individual liberty, absence of coercion, in the name of a spurious notion of freedom that relies on the state compelling some taxpayers to benefit others.
What role did Hayek see for the state then, if not extensive intervention to enable?
A minimal state. Its role is primarily to enforce general rules of just conduct applicable to all, like property rights and contract law, promote competition in the market, provide certain non-coercive services where the market falls short, like public health information, and perhaps ensure a minimum income below which no one falls.
But not equality.
Crucially, not make the market an instrument of distributive justice or attempt to equalize outcomes.
And how did he see the relationship between liberty and equality, particularly material equality?
He saw them, in his definition, as fundamentally in antithesis. Hayek argued that individuals differ naturally in skills, knowledge, talents, and effort. Treating people equally before the law, which his concept of freedom requires no arbitrary coercion, inevitably leads to material inequality in outcomes.
So trying to force equality.
Any attempt to achieve material equality or equality of condition requires the state to treat people unequally based on their circumstances, to engage in discriminatory coercion, taking from some to give to others. He believed this coercion destroys freedom.
He's quoted making this explicit. The equality before the law, which freedom requires, leads to material inequality.
Right. Any attempt by the state to make people more alike in their material condition, he argued, cannot justify using coercion in a free society. That's his core argument against redistributive policies, welfare programs, and much of what positive liberals or socialists advocate for.
The source offers several significant critiques of Hayek's position, despite acknowledging his influence.
First, it notes that in his focus on freedom from arbitrary coercion, he tends to ignore the claim of equal freedom for all individuals. His system might protect freedom, but not necessarily ensure everyone has a comparable amount of it, or is equally free from the coercion of circumstances shaped by others. Second, critics argue his ultimate justification for freedom isn't primarily for the individual's sake as an end in themselves, but for society's progress through the unplanned acquisition and use of dispersed knowledge. Yes. He argued liberty is essential because individual contributions to knowledge, innovation, and progress are unforeseeable and unpredictable. Society needs the freedom of individuals to experiment and discover. In fact, he provocatively suggested that if we were omniscient and knew everything already, less liberty would be needed.
So individuals are just tools for progress.
This implies the individual is a means to a social end. Progress, rather than freedom being valuable simply because it's essential to individual flourishing. And famously, he didn't believe the value of freedom should be judged by how many people desire it or how widely it's appreciated. Vital freedoms for social progress might not be widely sought or understood by the majority.
Leading to that somewhat controversial quote from the source.
Yes. It is better that some should be free than none, and better that many should have full freedom than that all should have a limited freedom. This suggests a willingness to accept significant inequality in freedom for the sake of a high level of freedom for a smaller group, justified by the potential for social progress.
That's quite a statement, prioritizing the potential of a few over a universal, if potentially limited, freedom for all.
It is. The source concludes the critique of Hayek by noting that his argument starts with the individual as an end, the liberal premise, but ends up reducing the individual to a means for social progress, which is seen as inconsistent with his own premise. It's also difficult, the source suggests, to ethically justify unequal amounts of freedom for individuals based on some unknown potential contribution to future social progress.
It certainly raises challenging questions about who benefits from freedom and why exactly it is valued. Is it an inherent right or a tool for collective advancement?
Exactly.
Next in this contemporary debate section is Milton Friedman, another major figure associated with negative liberty, particularly in his book, Capitalism and Freedom.
Friedman, much like Hayek, argued that capitalism, specifically a competitive market society, is a necessary condition for freedom, which he also defined as the absence of coercion of a man by his fellow men.
He saw individual and family freedom as the ultimate liberal goal in competitive capitalism, as both a fundamental component of that freedom and a necessary, though not sufficient, condition for political freedom.
His view is that economic freedom, market freedom, is a prerequisite for political freedom. And like Hayek, Friedman had contempt for policies aimed at material equality, seeing them as incompatible with his concept of freedom. He advocated for a severely minimal government.
What did minimal government mean for Friedman, based on the sources discussion and McPherson's interpretation?
The government should, in his view, only handle things the market absolutely cannot do, or only at prohibitive cost. Its role is essentially limited to sustaining and supplementing the market, nothing more.
So roll back to state.
McPherson's interpretation, quoted in the source, suggests this means government getting out of almost all welfare and regulatory functions, things like price and wage controls, social security, housing subsidies, occupational licensing, etc. A radical rolling back of the positive state.
So a drastic reduction of the state's role compared to what positive liberals argued for.
Exactly. But the source, specifically through McPherson's critique of Friedman, argues that Friedman makes an elementary conceptual error.
What was that error?
Confusing a simple exchange economy where individuals might trade goods they produce themselves with a capitalist economy. A capitalist economy is fundamentally characterized by the separation of labor and capital. Most people don't own the means of production, factories, land, etc., and must sell their labor to those who do.
So they lack real choice.
The labor force, lacking its own capital, therefore lacks true market choice in a fundamental sense. They are not just entering free exchanges, they are coerced by market forces beyond their individual control, the necessity to sell their labor to survive.
So freedom requires more than just market exchange.
Precisely. McPherson's point is that in such a system, man's need for creative freedom is obstructed because he is forced to sell his fundamental capabilities, his labor, his time, his skills, according to market needs determined by others, not according to his own will or developmental needs.
And the welfare state helps.
He argues a regulatory welfare state, by providing a safety net and establishing minimum standards, mitigates this fundamental coercion faced by those without capital, but Friedman opposes it. Hence, Friedman's concept is called ill-conceived and partial because it ignores the structural coercion within capitalism itself.
It seems the critique boils down to simply having a market free from state interference isn't enough for freedom if underlying power imbalances within that market, inherent to the capital-labor relationship, create coercion for those without capital.
That's the essence of McPherson's point on Friedman, highlighting a key difference in understanding the sources of unfreedom. Freedom from the state doesn't equal freedom from other powerful actors or market forces.
Finally, in this section on contemporary liberal thought, Robert Nozick in his work Anarchy, State, and Utopia. The source notes his explicit goal was to refute arguments for equality and justify inequality from a rights-based perspective.
He approached this by using a thought experiment building on Locke's idea of a state of nature and natural rights. Individuals form protective associations to defend their rights, and the dominant one in a geographical area essentially becomes a minimal state.
And for Nozick, the key moral principle is justice in holdings.
Meaning how property is acquired and transferred. Acquisition or transfer of property is just if it's done without force or fraud based on voluntary exchanges between individuals exercising their natural rights.
So the state's role is just protecting those rights?
Yes. The minimal state in this view is the only morally justifiable state because its function is strictly limited to maintaining these property rights, protecting individuals against force, theft, and fraud, and enforcing contracts. It does not, under any circumstances, engage in redistribution of wealth or holdings among citizens.
So inequalities that arise at the level of production or voluntary exchange shouldn't be fixed through distribution by the state.
Precisely. He allowed for a rare theoretical exception, like someone monopolizing the only source of water in a desert and charging exorbitant prices that might be problematic because it leverages a natural necessity.
But not for other things.
But he argued this logic doesn't apply to products of human effort and talent, like the discoverer of a fatal disease remedy being morally entitled to charge any price they wish, regardless of people's ability to pay. That wealth was justly acquired through effort and voluntary exchange.
His core assumption, then, seems to be that wealth and power inequality fundamentally come only from individual differences in talents, efforts, choices, and just transfers, operating within a framework of just acquisition.
And the source critiques this as the familiar argument of liberal individualists who, it claims, tend to ignore the significant role of differences in social status, inherited wealth, access to opportunities, and structural power imbalances in contributing to differential outputs and inequality in the real world.
So the argument ignores reality.
This view, the source argues, does not correspond to the realities of the capitalist system and is therefore ill-founded as a basis for justifying real-world inequality and rejecting any form of state-led redistribution.
So the argument against Nozick here is that he builds his entire case against redistribution and for a minimal state on a flawed, overly simplistic assumption about the origins of inequality, ignoring systemic and historical factors beyond individual merit and voluntary exchange.
That's the fundamental challenge posed by the source to his position, suggesting his abstract model doesn't reflect the complexities of actual capitalist societies.
Okay, so we've navigated the complex landscape of liberal individualist views on liberty, from early laissez-faire and the challenges it created, to the rise of positive liberalism and the welfare state, and finally to the contemporary libertarian pushback emphasizing negative liberty and minimal government, along with the source's critiques of these views.
It's quite a journey.
Now, let's turn to a very different conception of freedom, the Marxist view, which analyzes liberty through a distinct socioeconomic lens.
The Marxist concept of freedom, as presented in the source, is fundamentally different from the liberal tradition because it rejects the idea of the individual as an isolated, independent atom. It firmly analyzes freedom within specific socioeconomic and historical conditions.
So it's not about the isolated individual.
No. Marx and Engels, for example, in The Holy Family, are quoted explicitly rejecting the liberal idea of the atomized, alienated, possessive individual. They argued that members of civil society aren't isolated atoms, encountering each other purely by chance in the market.
Then how are they connected?
They emphasize that natural needs, the need to work and produce, and the material conditions of existence naturally connect individuals. Civil society, the web of relationships beyond the state, exists precisely because these needs and conditions hold individuals together in a system of interdependence.
They also reject the utilitarian liberal idea that the common interest is simply an aggregation or sum of individual self-interests pursued in the market.
Yes. Instead, they argue that a true common interest requires actively creating socioeconomic conditions conducive to freedom and human flourishing within society as a whole. This includes ensuring access to material means necessary for a dignified life and providing genuine opportunities for self-development.
And the key is?
A rational system of production geared towards meeting human needs as the key. Lewis is quoted here summarizing this Marxist point.
So freedom isn't just about non-interference by the state or others. It's about having the material basis, the social security, and the opportunity to satisfy your wants and develop your full potential as a human being. It requires a certain kind of society and economy.
Exactly. And the source details Friedrich Engels' concept of the leap from necessity to freedom, most clearly articulated in his work Anti-Düring. This is a core idea in the Marxist view of history and human development.
This starts with defining necessity in Engels' terms. What is necessity?
Necessity, for Engels, is life governed by objective natural laws like gravity, or the laws of economics under capitalism laws that exist and operate independently of individual human will. Man can come to know and harness these laws through science and technology, but he cannot change the laws themselves.
So we're subject to these laws.
Engels states that necessity is blind, only if not understood. The more we understand these objective laws, the less blind and constraining they are.
And freedom, then, is what?
Freedom, in this Marxist view, is defined as control over oneself and over nature, based on knowledge of these natural and social necessities. It's not ignoring the rules, it's understanding them deeply and using that understanding to achieve definite human ends.
So knowledge is key.
It's a product of historical development. Early man, struggling against nature without understanding, was as unfree as an animal, completely subject to external forces. But each step forward in human knowledge, in culture, and technological mastery is a step towards increasing freedom.
So it's about understanding the rules of the world, both natural and social, and being able to operate within them or strategically with them, effectively to shape your environment and life, rather than simply being shaped by them.
Yes, applying that understanding to achieve definite conscious goals. But the source argues that capitalism, for Marxists, represents a state of necessity and constraint despite its technological advancements.
How so? If we have technology.
Because, as Engels is quoted, capitalism is characterized by inherent contradictions that lead to continual crises. Society, despite possessing immense productive capacity, is, quote, suffocated beneath the weight of its own productive forces and products, unable to use them fully or rationally, leading to gluts and depressions.
Well, people still need things.
Meanwhile, the very producers of this wealth, the working class, lack the means for consumption. The productive forces of society burst their capitalist bonds. Private ownership for profit leading to crisis.
So under capitalism, humanity has the potential for freedom from want and necessity due to its productive capacity. But the system prevents this potential from being realized for most people, keeping them subject to economic necessity.
Precisely. The solution, according to this view, is the socialization of the means of production, bringing factories, land, technology under collective, rational control rather than private ownership for profit. This is seen as the necessary way to overcome the inherent contradictions and crises of capitalism and usher in a new era of freedom.
This leads to the actual leap from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom. What is this leap?
Engels describes this leap as the moment when man's own social organization, how production and distribution are arranged, how society functions, becomes the result of his own conscious, free action, no longer imposed by blind economic laws of capitalism or the necessities of history.
Humanity takes control.
Objective social forces, instead of dominating him as alien powers, like the market appearing as an uncontrollable force, come under human control through rational planning and collective action. Man, with full consciousness, makes his own history, instead of being tossed about by economic cycles.
So we control the outcomes.
The social causes he sets in motion through conscious planning have their intended results, rather than unintended chaotic consequences. This is the leap from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom.
So freedom isn't just personal autonomy within the existing system. It's humanity collectively gaining rational control over its own social and economic destiny, overcoming the blind forces of necessity.
That's the core Marxist idea of collective self-determination as the basis for individual freedom. And the source points to the depiction of the future communist society in the Communist Manifesto by Marx and Engels as the realization of this state of freedom.
What is freedom like in that ultimate Marxist vision?
With class distinctions gone and the means of production socialized and rationally planned, public power loses its political character, which Marxists saw as rooted in class oppression. In this future association, Marx and Engels write,
The famous quote.
"The free development of each is the condition for the free development of all."
That quote is often cited as capturing the essence of the Marxist ideal of freedom, and it stands in contrast to purely individualist liberal notions. Freedom isn't just something I achieve for myself, potentially at the expense of others.
Right. My freedom is fundamentally interconnected with yours and depends on the freedom of everyone else. It fundamentally links individual freedom to the collective structure and state of society, arguing genuine individual freedom can only be realized when the whole society is rationally organized to maximize the potential of its members.
The source also discusses the humanist basis of Marx's concept of freedom, particularly drawing from his earlier, more philosophical works like the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844.
This is where Marx provides the ethical basis and deep humanist foundations for his critique of capitalism and vision of communism. He severely criticized capitalism not just for inequality, but for its profound dehumanizing effect, causing alienation.
Alienation, what's that?
A state of being separated from something essential to one's nature. And he identified 4 interconnected levels of alienation specifically caused by features of capitalist production, like commodity production, the extreme division of labor, and private ownership.
Okay, what are the 4 levels?
First, alienation from one's own product and the work process itself. Workers don't own what they produce, it belongs to the capitalist. They also have little control over the process of work, performing repetitive, fragmented tasks dictated by others. The work itself becomes external to them. Second, alienation from nature and from creative work. Work under capitalism, in Marx's view, becomes routinized, monotonous, and purely a means to an end, earning money, lacking a sense of creative satisfaction or connection to the natural world or the application of one's unique human capacities. It becomes forced labor.
Third level.
Third, alienation from other men. The capitalist system is based on competition worker against worker, capitalist against capitalist. Relationships between people are mediated by market transactions and dominated by irreconcilable class interests, capitalist versus worker. Everyone is potentially living at someone else's expense or in competition with them, hindering genuine human connection and community.
And fourth, the deepest level.
Alienation from oneself, from one's species essence or fundamental human nature. Because the realm of necessity, working to survive, dominates, life is reduced to an animal existence focused on basic needs, leaving no room for the development of human faculties like culture, art, intellectual pursuits, or genuinely free creative activity.
So capitalism itself causes this separation from our true nature.
Capitalism, in this view, subordinates fundamental human needs and creative faculties to the logic of private property and capital accumulation. Even the capitalist, Marx argued, is alienated, seen as a slave to the tyrannical rule of money, driven by the abstract force of capital rather than human needs.
So alienation is the profound state of unfreedom, a distortion of human nature. And capitalism is the primary cause of this profound alienation by structuring society around private property and profit rather than human needs and development.
The deliverance from this alienation, according to Marxists, comes from realizing that society is a human creation, meant to attain fuller freedom and development for all. This potential is obstructed by the system of private property, which reaches its most alienating form under capitalism.
And a socialist revolution, in this view, isn't just about economic restructuring. It's about restoring human values, overcoming alienation, and inaugurating this new era of freedom where humanity takes control.
Yes. Engels is quoted saying that the proletariat, by freeing the means of production from capitalist ownership, enables socialized, planned production for need, class distinctions vanish, the state as an instrument of class rule withers away, and man becomes master of his own form of social organization, becomes at the same time the lord over nature, his own master free.
So the core contrast reiterated by the source is clear. The liberal tradition, even in its positive forms, largely seeks freedom through adjustments and regulations within the capitalist system.
While Marxism argues that genuine freedom, particularly the overcoming of alienation and the achievement of collective self-determination, requires transforming the capitalist system itself. It's a fundamental difference in diagnosis of the problem and the proposed solution, leading to very different conceptions of what freedom means and how it is achieved.
Finally, the source touches briefly on some neo-Marxist perspectives on freedom, mentioning Herbert Marcuse and C.B. Macpherson, who offered updated critiques of freedom in advanced capitalist societies.
Herbert Marcuse, often associated with the Frankfurt School and seen as a neo-Marxist figure, is presented as critical of contemporary Western society, emphasizing a subjective, critical, humanist form of Marxism distinct from the authoritarian Soviet version.
He critiqued modern affluent capitalism, particularly in works like One-Dimensional Man. What was his critique?
His critique went beyond just economic exploitation to analyze how advanced capitalism exerts control not just over production, but over desires and consciousness, particularly through mass media, advertising, and technology. It creates what he called a distorted second nature in people, a focus on consumption and material goods.
And this leads to a particularly disturbing idea in his work, that alienation in consumer capitalism makes the oppressed not revolutionary, but insensitive to their own discontent and lack of freedom.
That's the chilling part. How so? By satisfying superficial or trivial material desires through consumer goods and entertainment, the system, according to Marcuse, integrates individuals so effectively that it dulls the genuine urge for radical freedom or fundamental change.
So people don't even realize they're unfree.
Alienated people become unaware of their own alienation, accepting their condition. This means that achieving freedom requires a kind of awakening to recognize the underlying unfreedom.
His vision of freedom, particularly from Eros and Civilization, sounds quite utopian, integrating psychological and social liberation.
Yes. He envisioned a democratic community where technology could reduce necessary labor, allowing work to become more like play, where necessary labor harmonizes with needs and desires, and where surplus repression, social controls beyond what's necessary for basic order, is eliminated, allowing for the free expression of human creativity and eros.
So technology could free us.
He was optimistic that Western society already possessed the technological capacity to provide for everyone's needs, thereby creating the material basis for freedom and dignity, if only people understood the true nature of their condition and potential.
But the source notes criticisms of Marcuse's view.
Some question his assumption that technology can satisfy potentially endless human needs and desires, pointing to issues like the happiness gap, increased wealth not necessarily leading to increased
And
happiness.
is Marxism.
And more significantly for his claim to be a Marxist, he lost faith in the working class as the primary agent of revolutionary change, seeing them as too integrated and pacified by consumerism. He pinned his hopes instead on a marginal elite, unbrainwashed students, racial minorities, the poorest strata, which critics argue undermines a core tenet of traditional Marxist theory that the proletariat is the revolutionary class.
Which critics argue removes his analysis too far from the economic base that defines Marxism.
It certainly challenges a core tenet of traditional Marxist theory regarding who brings about change.
The other neo-Marxist figure mentioned, although the source notes he didn't claim the Marxist label himself, is C.B. Macpherson, known for his critiques of capitalism and his analysis of power.
In works like Democratic Theory, Macpherson analyzed Western democratic theory, arguing it was characterized by two underlying principles, often in tension. First, the maximization of utilities, seeing man primarily as a consumer, a bundle of appetites to be satisfied reflecting traditional utilitarianism.
And second,
And second, the maximization of powers, seeing man as a doer, a creator, a being who develops and exercises capacities, reflecting the influence of thinkers like Mill and Green.
he saw the essence of freedom lying in the full realization of one's creative faculties and capacities, which is achieved through what he called developmental power.
He contrasted this crucial concept with extractive power. What's that? Extractive power he defined as the power to use others' capacities or potentials for one's own ends. He argued that traditional political theory, developed alongside capitalist relations, often defined power largely as this extractive power, the power of command, the power to make others work for you.
And how did he use this framework to critique capitalism?
Macpherson argued that in capitalist market society, owners of capital possess immense extractive power, the power to hire labor and direct the capacities of non-owners for their own profit. Meanwhile, those who do not own capital, the poor, have negligible developmental power, limited opportunity or means to develop their own capacities according to their own will, and zero extractive power. The poor are effectively forced by market necessity to sell their capabilities, their labor, their time, their potential, according to the needs and terms dictated by those with capital, which, he argued, fundamentally erodes their creative freedom or developmental power.
So even with formal civil and political freedoms, the underlying economic structure under capitalism, characterized by this imbalance of extractive and developmental power, inherently limits the creative freedom of the disadvantaged.
That's his argument.
Right.
And his conclusion, as quoted, is that only the welfare state variety of capitalism, with its regulations, social safety nets, and public services, offers some significant check on economic power, extractive power, by political power, the collective will expressed through the state,
So the welfare state helps developmental power.
thereby offering some limited enhancement of developmental power for more people compared to a purely laissez-faire system.
So, summarizing this incredible deep dive, we've traced the concept of liberty from a fundamental human quality driving revolutionary struggles for equality to the difficult problem of balancing individual claims with societal needs.
Leading to the necessity of regulation to prevent license and the need for legitimate authority.
We've explored the different dimensions, civil, political, and economic, noting how each sphere presents unique challenges and requires different kinds of adjustments and conditions to ensure meaningful freedom for all.
Particularly highlighting the economic sphere, where the conflict between different interpretations of freedom, especially positive and negative, is most acute and impactful on daily life.
And we've seen the historical debate between negative liberty, defined as absence of restraint, associated with classical liberalism, laissez-faire economics, and a minimal state, and positive liberty, defined as the state removing impediments and creating conditions for freedom, leading to the development of positive liberalism in the welfare state.
We then contrasted this with contemporary libertarian views, Berlin, Hayek, Friedman, Nozick, who strongly re-emphasize negative liberty and a minimal state, and are critiqued for potentially ignoring social and economic structures as significant sources of unfreedom, making inconsistent arguments or basing their views on flawed assumptions about inequality.
And finally, we look at the Marxist view, which sees freedom as fundamentally tied to socioeconomic conditions and argues it requires a transformation of the system itself to overcome alienation caused by capitalism and allow humanity to collectively control its destiny.
Moving from necessity to freedom, aiming for a society where the free development of each benefits and is conditional on the freedom of all. and the neo-Marxist perspectives of Marcuse and McPherson, offering updated critiques of modern capitalism, highlighting new forms of alienation from consumerism or the erosion of creative freedom under market forces and power imbalances.
It's a journey from a seemingly simple, universally desired idea to a complex, contested web of competing philosophies about human nature, the structure of society, the sources of unfreedom, and the legitimate role of the state. Whew.
The quest for freedom, as the source concludes, is not a settled matter. It's continuous and evolves with societal changes. And a key insight shared by some of these thinkers across different traditions is that genuine or maximum freedom isn't something enjoyed in isolated individualism, but often requires a specific, conducive social and economic order.
Ending with that powerful phrase drawn from Marx, but resonating with the arguments for interdependence and social conditions for freedom. Genuine freedom for the individual is best attained where the free development of each will be the necessary condition for free development of all.
A thought that fundamentally challenges the idea of freedom as a purely solitary pursuit, suggesting it's deeply social.
So, reflecting on all these different, sometimes conflicting perspectives we've unpacked today, the classical liberal idea of just being left alone, the positive liberal idea of the state enabling freedom, the Marxist idea of systemic transformation to overcome alienation and necessity, the libertarian emphasis on minimal government and property rights, the neo-Marxist critique of consumer culture and power imbalances.
That's a lot to consider.
How did these different understandings of liberty shape the political debates we see today? Debates about the role of government in the economy, about welfare programs, about regulations, about inequality, and about individual versus collective responsibility. And does pursuing one specific type of liberty, like absolute economic freedom, inherently risk sacrificing another type, like the freedom from want or the freedom to develop one's capacities?
These historical and philosophical debates are very much alive, and they leave us with those crucial questions about what kind of freedom we truly value and what society needs to look like to achieve it, and for whom.
It really makes you think about what freedom means to you personally and what kind of society is truly required to achieve it for everyone, based on these powerful and competing arguments from the source.
A concept that is anything but simple.
A fascinating deep dive into the heart of political theory. Thank you for joining us for this exploration.